Thank you, Lara. And as I said, my name is Matt. I'm a high school science teacher located up in Tamworth. I absolutely love astronomy, and I get to present to you today on the Dobsonian telescope. With regards to telescopes in schools, this particular type of telescope is really good because you'll see it's really easy to set up and use with your students, and it actually provides a really great view of the night sky without being too big. So when we talk about this telescope, its aperture, the size of the main mirror is 8 inches wide. You can get aperture fever, which is when you think a bigger telescope is better, but you also like your back. So I've lifted a 12-inch telescope, and they're not kind, a 12-inch Dobsonian. So the 8-inch gives us a really nice view of the night sky, collects quite a lot of light, but we can actually handle it. So I'm now going to start sharing my screen with you, and we'll get started with the presentation. And so as you can see on the title slide here, how to use your Dobsonian telescope. I won't be referring to these slides too much because it's more of an interactive presentation, so we can actually see what we're doing. But as you can see on this title slide, I volunteer for Astro 3D and sort of, work with them and with Lara and their other staff in helping science teachers teach astronomy and astrophysics. So we'll jump into the next slide here. And as you can see, this is the goal of today, is to go through a few of these points. And there's the telescope there on the right-hand side. First of all, I'll introduce the telescope again. The telescope that we're talking about today is the Bintel 8-inch Dobsonian. Bintel's a company located in Sydney. However, they don't actually make the telescope. It's a brand called GSO that Bintel get to make it. And there's a few features of it that I'm going to point out now that make this telescope quite unique or quite good at using for students. The first thing you'll notice is where my mouse cursor is. There's actually a silver focuser and a black one as well. So it has both a coarse and a fine focus. That's really good if you want to bring something into view and make it really crisp and clear using that fine focus. And I'll have my telescope set up in a moment so you can actually see these pieces a little bit larger. The other thing that I'm going to talk about first of all is this part here, which is the finder scope. I like to tell my students that the finder scope is like a mini telescope. It really helps us find what we're looking for in the night sky before we try and look through the main eyepiece. One feature of the finder scope that I'll just point out with my mouse cursor just here is this 45-degree diagonal. The reason why that's good and why that's good for this particular telescope is some telescopes come with a straight through finder scope, so you have to like bend your back and be a contortionist to look through it. Whereas this one, you can actually just lean over and look in the finder scope. I'm just going to run through these points on the left-hand side there and then actually physically set this telescope up so you can see it. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to mount the telescope on the base. So you can see on this picture on the right-hand side, this is the base, which you would have assembled, and you can move it left and right. And then the telescope, we can move up and down on this pivot point. And then as it says there, we need to find what I refer to as the 0, point, which is like the balance point of the telescope. If you get this point, the balance point done incorrectly, and I got an email from a teacher in Western Australia, said that the telescope was always dipping, was always falling. And I said, can you take a photo of how it's mounted? And they actually had the balance point incorrect. So that's pretty important for the ease of your viewing. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the finder scope. As I said, I'm going to talk about how to focus it, because out of the box, when you get it, it might be focused or it might not be focused. And knowing how to fix that is quite important. The next thing is how to attach it to this telescope. That's quite simple. But the next part is really important, which is aligning the finder scope. If the finder scope's not aligned properly, the viewing of the night sky is actually going to be quite problematic. So I'm going to go through the process in how you can align this. I'll talk briefly about the dual speed focuser, but I want to talk also about where we attach the eyepieces. And I'll have my telescope set up so we can have a look at that. And then we'll talk about the Telrad and what it is and how we can use it. So first of all, I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pin my video. Okay, so what you can see here in front of you is the Dobsonian telescope. And if I just bring it closer to the camera, you can see that we have these points here that it mounts on. And I'm just going to grab my Allen key, which is right next door to me just here. And I'm going to move the base back a little bit. And I'll bring the camera a lot closer. And so you'll notice with this particular component and these screws that this can slide up and slide down. And one thing that you want to be aware of is that if we put it at the very bottom, that's going to affect the balance point. And I've just pulled that out to slide it up. So these screws have been attached, but they're not fully tight. So to find the balance point, I've found that generally the 0 point works really well. And if you notice, if I line that up with 0 at the top, it's also going to be 0 below as well. So I'm going to tighten this up and then show you what it looks like. It's really handy having a nice one of these Allen keys in your telescope box. So the top one's tight now. I'm now going to tighten up the bottom one. There we go. So I'm now going to take you in nice and close and just show you that I've got it on 0 at the top. And if we look below, we're also on 0 at the bottom. Because I've done that to that side, I'm also going to do that to this side. Excellent. So now they're both done up nice and tight. And I've got the telescope orientated that I've got the opening to the telescope at the top here. That's really important that whilst you're working at it, you're sitting on its primary mirror down the bottom here. If you're outside, you want to put that on a nice piece of carpet outside. Typically, you don't want to put that on concrete or anything. And then the next thing we're going to do is mount this on the base. So when we mount this on the base, that's the base there. I'm just putting the front of the base to the left here. And I'm going to have the eyepiece towards me. So if the base is pointing to the left, we want the focuser, I should say, towards me. And we're just going to put this on. And as you can see down the bottom here, the shape of these U's, we want the curved part at the bottom and the flat part at the top. And so you're just going to make sure that they're both flat on top. I'm just going to check the other one and tighten a little bit. Yes, it's flat on top. And now I can put this on the base. And I'm going to loosen that off a little bit by turning it left and loosen the other one and then tighten them up. And what you can see is that telescope sitting there quite nicely. If I was to put the telescope in this position and loosen these off, you can see that that telescope swung back, which means at the moment, it's back heavy, it's bottom heavy. The reason why I'm not too concerned about this at this point in time is because I haven't attached the finder scope and I haven't put an eyepiece in there. So that telescope's now orientated correctly. And we're going to switch back to my laptop so we can talk about the finder scope. Awesome. So I'm just going to talk about the finder scope. If you have your finder scope with you, you can get it if you like, so you can actually see what I'm talking about. So if you do have your finder scope, here it is. So as I said, the finder scope is like a mini telescope. It is really important for viewing the night sky. Without the finder scope, it's very, very difficult to find objects like planets. Even finding the moon without a finder scope is difficult. So when you pack away the finder scope, or when you take it out of its box, it might be like this. All right, and then as you mount it on the telescope, it's now going to face upwards like this. Now, this actually does have a focus, but it's not a focus where you're actually going to adjust a focus knob. The focusing actually occurs at the front here. So I'm going to talk about this because out of the box, these might appear unfocused and you might need to focus it. How this works is you can see that there's two different rings. There's the very front one there, which is about probably about 5 centimeters long. And then there's another ring that's about 1 centimeter long. With the ring at the back here, if I turn that and hold the front one, but turn the rear ring clockwise, I then loosen it. And this one at the back here, you can think of as the locking ring. The one at the front is how you focus it. So if you were going to focus this, you actually want to be looking out a window at something in the very, very far distance through the finder scope. And you're going to turn the front part of the finder scope until you get a perfect crisp image. As I said, sometimes out of the box, they're perfect. Sometimes out of the box, they're out of focus and you might need to do this. And then sometimes it's painful. You're like, why isn't it working? So you need to calibrate it. So I might look out the window here and I can just do this from where I'm sitting at a hill in the distance. Once I've turned this front metal part and I've achieved a nice focus, so that we can lock this, we actually turn the locking ring behind it, and you keep turning that as far as you can and as tight as you can until it locks. And that's pretty good. So I've now focused my finder scope. The next thing we're going to talk about is how to mount the finder scope, and this is quite simple, but I'm just going to go through this. So going back to the telescope here, we're going to mount the finder scope on top in this little bracket here. Sometimes over time, these screws that I'll just show you from above, these screws may become loose over a long period of time. To tighten them up, you can just use a Phillips head screwdriver. Obviously, you want to be quite careful because as you can see, just where my finger is pointing inside the tube there, on the inside of the tube is some nuts that those screws go into. So you just don't want those nuts to fall down inside the telescope. But so that I can show you this, I've just turned these to the right and turning them to the right on both sides to lock the telescope into this position. Then I'm going to mount the finder scope by just sliding it on that little foothold there and tightening up this thumb screw. Obviously, that can take a flathead screwdriver, but you can actually get this tight enough by hand, and you just want to tighten that as hard as you can so that that finder scope's not going anywhere. The next thing that we need to talk about is actually how to align the finder scope. So to do this, we actually want to use something in the distance. And we want to point the telescope and the finder scope at an object. And this could be a tree. It could be a street light. It could be a star at night. I typically recommend not picking stars, because if you pick a star, there's no guarantee that the star you're looking at through the finder scope is the same as the telescope. But what we want to do here is, first of all, put an eyepiece in. So I'll just quickly do that. And I'll talk more about eyepieces in a moment. Okay. Once we have the eyepiece in, we can point the telescope into the distance. As I said, if you're pointing at a tree, you want to point at a specific point on the tree, like a fork in the tree. And then what we're going to do is we need to align the finder scope to the telescope. So just to say that again, we need to make sure that the finder scope is pointing to and pointing at exactly what the telescope is seeing. So we align the finder scope to this, not aligning this to this. The reason why we do that is, as I said earlier, we actually use the finder scope to see things in the night sky, to find them before we look through the telescope. And so to do that, I'm just going to set this telescope up. So as you can see, I've got this telescope set up. And if I look through the finder scope, you can just see a crosshair in the middle. It's a little bit faint and it's a little bit out of focus. That's due to, there it is there. And so what you can see is on the finder scope, there is 3 pins. There's one there, one at the top, one on the left, and one on the right. The one on the bottom left is spring-loaded. So because it's spring-loaded, we can't actually change that. But what we can do is we can turn this one. And I'll just show you what happens as I turn this. So you can see that crosshair moving up the hill. It's moved up the hill, and I'll turn it the opposite way. And it's moved down the hill. So this one controls the vertical axis. This one on the side here controls the horizontal axis. And so what you want to do is, we'll just see if we can get this aligned. Where are we? No, I might have trouble. Oh, that's out of focus. But what we're going to do is look through this eyepiece and point the telescope at some feature in the distance there. As I said, you might pick a shed or the corner of a roof line or a light. And once you can see it in the middle of this eyepiece, you then want to come back to the finder scope and use this screw on top and this screw on the side to make sure the finder scope crosshair, so that crosshair in the middle there is directly pointing to whatever feature we're looking at. Whilst I'm just getting set back up, does anybody have any questions about the finder scope at this point in time? Thumbs up if you are all good. Awesome.
Just quickly, Matt, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Our finder scope has a single barrel for the eye lens, not a 45. So just wondering, obviously it'd be a lot better to have a 45. Are they easily sourced for these finder scopes?
Yes. So if you don't have a 45 and you've just got a straight through, you can either, the easiest thing is actually to buy a new finder scope.
Yep.
Because you typically can't just buy the single 45 for the finder scope, but yeah, you can buy a new finder scope and that'll work fine.
All right, awesome. Thank you.
And just to add to Jay's question and his point is, as I said, the negative thing about a straight through finder scope is sometimes you have to become a contortionist to get your body in the right position to look through it. And it can hurt your back after a whole night of observing. Cool. So we've gone through the finder scope, how to attach it, how to focus it, and then how to align it. Aligning is the most important part. And if it's your first time doing this, or if you've done it for many times, I always try and align my finder scope during the day, if you can, because that way it's done, it's out of the way. Sometimes at nighttime, especially if you've got kids, like school children, they'll just mob you at the start and you're like, no, go away, I need to do some aligning. And so, especially with their excitement, they're just running around like crazy. But yeah, aligning the finder scope during the day is good. Or at dusk, when you're just about to start observing, you pick a street light in the distance and start aligning the finder scope. Once you've aligned the finder scope, you can obviously start observing. And I'm just going to go back to my presentation for a moment. So as we've said, we've attached it, we've focused it and aligned it. We've focused it using those front rings. We've attached it with a thumb screw and we've aligned it using a tree in the distance. And by a tree, a fork in the tree, a light. The moon is good. As I said, I don't recommend a star. The reason is there's no guarantee you're looking at exactly the same star. Now we're going to talk about eyepieces and the dual speed focuser and how to attach them. So the telescope you have, it may be the Bintel Dobsonian or it could be a Skywatcher Dobsonian. The Bintel Dobsonians come with a particular eyepiece. I don't have one with me at the moment, but the really wide one. Has anyone got a really wide eyepiece? The wide eyepiece is actually a 2-inch eyepiece, and I'm going to show you how to attach that now. I'll just pin my screen again. Tim's got a 2-inch eyepiece. Awesome, Tim. And so just looking at the telescope here, and I'm going to take this eyepiece out. Just looking at the anatomy of our telescope, you can see that there's quite a lot of screws here. There's this top screw and then there's these two side screws. Sorry, this top screw and this side screw here. And then there's this one here. And you'll notice that this piece actually comes out. So this piece I'm looking at right now is known as a 2-inch to 1 1/4 adapter. So what that means is if I take this out, the hole that it's left is a 2-inch diameter hole, which is going to take a 2-inch eyepiece. And so when you slide that eyepiece in, you then do up the thumb screw above and do up the thumb screw to the side. And then you've got a beautiful 2-inch eyepiece. Most of the eyepieces that are used by visual astronomers look more like this. So instead of having a really, really wide barrel, they've only got a 1 1/4 inch barrel. And so to use the smaller eyepieces, we need this adapter, which is the 2-inch to 1 1/4 inch adapter. Because I did up those thumb screws, I'll need to untighten them. Put my adapter in and it just slides in nicely and then do that up. Now with the dual speed focuser, you can see that there's the coarse focus and the fine focus. So obviously I'm going to use the coarse first and we can bring it all the way out or we can go all the way in. One common issue that sometimes occurs is you may not be able to achieve focus and you might think something's wrong with your telescope. And I'll tell you what could be happening. Sometimes with your eyepiece, if you put it in the telescope and you let it go all the way in and you tighten it up and you go from all the way in with the focus, winding out, so all the way out, sometimes you do not achieve focus. And this can be really annoying because you think, once again, there's something wrong with the telescope. And what's actually occurring is this eyepiece is still not far enough out. So to make this eyepiece go further out, you can do one of two things. You can undo this thumb screw just here on the left-hand side, this one here, and then pull this eyepiece out a little bit and then tighten it up. And then you'll notice that I've pulled that out by about 1 centimeter. I may have gone past the focal point. And so to focus it, I'll actually need to now potentially go in a little bit. So that's just something that I mentioned because sometimes, as I said, you might, if the eyepiece is all the way in, and I'm talking about it's slotted in and you've tightened it and you've used the focus and you've gone all the way in, then all the way out, and you still haven't found focus, you can then undo that thumb screw, slide that out a little bit, tighten that back up, and then you might be achieving focus. And that also can happen. So you can also fix that problem by undoing these two screws and sliding the 2-inch to 1 1/4 adapter a little bit out. But typically I leave that fully done up and I'm just moving the eyepiece there and tightening it. With regards to eyepieces, it's similar to a microscope in the sense that you always want to start with the lowest magnification first. And so I'm just going to switch back to my screen. So with regards to eyepieces, we want to start with the lowest magnification so we can actually find our target. And your target could be something like the moon. It might be a cluster of stars. It could be a planet. If you're doing this with students and you're running a sort of an astronomy club at your school, I recommend the first couple of sessions that you do with your students actually be straight after school. It doesn't have to be at nighttime. That way they can actually practice using the telescope, practice focusing it, and practice finding something. So when I do this with my son, who's 7, I just give him challenges that say, can you focus on that tree in the distance on that hill? And so he has to get that tree in the eyepiece using the finder scope, and then and by that I mean the finder scope on top there, and then get it in the main eyepiece, and then get it in focus. So with regards to using a wide view eyepiece or using a low magnification, there's actually a formula that we can use to work out the magnification of an eyepiece. And it's on your screen right now. Then, so the simple calculation is we get the focal length of the telescope and we divide that by the focal length of the eyepiece. So if you have the Bintel Dobsonian, it's got a focal length of 1,200 millimeters. And if you divide that by 30, which is the focal length of the large 2-inch eyepiece, it actually shows you what magnification is, which is a 40 times magnification. So that's really good for the moon and open clusters. If you're looking at a planet like Saturn or Venus or Jupiter or Mars, you actually want to use a smaller focal length. A smaller number with here actually results in higher magnification. And so just simply the rule of thumb, always start with a large number for your eyepiece and then work your way downwards. And the reason for this is you actually want to find whatever you're looking at in the telescope before you then switch to potentially a 10 mil eyepiece, because a 10 mil eyepiece is going to be 120 times magnification. And once again, you can think of this similar to using a microscope. You always want to find what you're looking at on the 4 times and then step it all the way up. This is similar to that. So I'm just going to show you this little box, and then we'll move on to talking about the Telrad. I'm just going to pin my camera again. So if you want somewhere to store your eyepieces to make sure they actually last quite a long time, you can get these hard cases from Bunnings, these foam boxes. And I'm just going to talk about two different eyepieces because we can talk about their what they can do. So you'll notice this one's a 32 millimeter eyepiece. So this one is low magnification compared to this one, which is 13. And so if I was looking at Saturn, I would always start off with a higher number. And once I find Saturn and I put it dead in the middle of the field of view, I'll then take this eyepiece out and then put the 13 mil in. Before I move on to talking about Telrads, does anyone have any questions about eyepieces? Just give me a bit of a thumbs up if you have a 2-inch eyepiece, or if you know if you've got a 2-inch eyepiece. So Jay's got one, Tim knows he's got one, awesome. Yes, I think, yep, Sam, that's awesome. Sam, if everyone wants to look at Sam's feed, if you just go on gallery view, Sam, can I just pin you for a moment? Can you hold that really close to the camera? Yep. Okay, this is it. And there it is. That's a beautiful 2-inch eyepiece. And you see just how big it is. I like to call that eyepiece like the open cluster hunter. If you look at the moon or an open cluster of stars with that, it looks really, really good. So the 2-inch eyepieces are really good for open clusters of stars. They're really good for the moon. They're also really good just for finding things. So if you find Saturn in a 2-inch eyepiece, that's it there, Shane. That's awesome. Yeah, that's the beautiful one there. Yeah. So that's my favorite eyepiece when I'm doing outreach events with students, because it's really easy to find things. And then, as I said, when you switch from the 2-inch eyepiece to the 1 1/4, you then need to use that adapter. And so I know the one that you had, Shane, and I think the one that Sam, you were holding says 30 millimeters on the side. So that actually gives you a really nice wide view. And
yeah,
then
it said 30 mil on the side.
Awesome. Yeah. And that's, as I said, that's one of my favorite eyepieces. Then, as I said, you put the adapter in, and then you'll switch to a 1 1/4 inch. And what we're talking about by inches is the diameter of the barrel there. And then you could still have the same magnification. So this one, as I said, has actually got the same magnification as the one that Sam and Shane held up. It's approximately 32 mils, which is similar to the 30. But if I then want to make something look really, really large, I'll then switch to the high magnification eyepiece, which has the smaller number. If you want any information about eyepieces, feel free to get my contact details off Lara, and I can send you some information about different eyepieces. Some are really good, some are not so good, so I'm happy to chat to you about that. Now we're going to talk about a Telrad. Has anyone got a Telrad in their possession? I'll just check. I'm guessing not many. No. Oh, yes. Yep. Sam has and Jay has. Awesome. Awesome. I'm going to pin Jay. Can I pin your view if that's all right? Can you just hold that close to the camera? Awesome. So I'm just going to talk about this because at the moment, I don't physically have one with me. And so if you can just, if you want to hold it like that just for a second, if you look at the clear part that Jay is holding up, there's a bit of glass at 45 degrees and then perfect, nice rotation there. Just where you can see there's a lens at the bottom there, and it's actually going to work like a projection. So it projects an image up onto that glass, and you can actually see it exactly right. The image it projects is either going to be a red or a green reticle. A reticle is just a fancy word for concentric circles. And the cool thing about a Telrad versus an actual finder scope is it's got 0 zoom magnification. So there's no magnification whatsoever. You can just attach it to your telescope. And I'll talk about how you attach it and then how you align it. So if you just look at where Jay's hands are, there's 3 little knobs, and they're the knobs for actually aligning the Telrad. So you can actually move where the reticle is. Jay, can you just hold that upside down for just a moment? Just so you can see the bottom of it. Yep, awesome. You'll notice there that there's the feet of the towel rad. And how this works is the towel rad will also come with a plate. Yes, could you please hold the plate? Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you very much. This is like a team presentation now. And you'll notice that on the plate, there's 2 strips of sticky tape or like adhering tape. And the way that you do this is you peel off the tape and you bind the base to the actual tube of the telescope. And I'm just going to talk about this now and show you my feed. And then I'll just talk about how you actually attach it. So I'm just going to switch back to my camera. And thank you very much, Jay. And I'm just going to go here. Awesome. So if you're looking at attaching the towel rad, we obviously aren't going to attach it here. And we're not going to attach it here because that's in the way. We could actually attach it just here. Another place that you just want to be mindful of is when we store this in the box, it might actually get in the way on this side. So the towel rad could go just here. And you just want to be mindful that you want to put it in a position that you're not going to have to look over too far and swap sides of the telescope. So if you bind it just to here on the body and put the base here, that could be a really nice position for you. When you put the base on the telescope, it's really important that you get that in line, because if that's askew, then you're not going to be looking along the barrel of the telescope. So you could do this with 2 people to just try and sight it to make sure it's in line with the body of the telescope. And when I've aligned my towel rads in the past on my telescopes, I've actually just done this by eye. Like I haven't made any measurements or any markings. I've just tried to bind it to the telescope and make sure it's in line. The thing I'd like to do now is throw to you, the users of the telescope, and see if you have any questions about how to use your Dobsonians, or if you've got any questions in general. You can either put them in the chat or ask them live.
Just a quick thing then. Which is the better system, towel rad or finder scope?
Yeah, that's not a bad question. The thing I like about the towel rad is with the finder scope, you're actually looking at a smaller patch of the sky because there's magnification and the rest of the sky is blocked out. So the cool thing about the towel rad is because it's 0 zoom and you can physically see the sky, it's a lot easier to align things because you'll definitely know if you're not on the moon. And you can see whereabouts the moon is in reference to your towel rad. That's a really good question. So I think, you can definitely leave the finder scope on the telescope, but also have the towel rad. And 2 people could be potentially looking at the same time. 1 person through the towel rad and 1 through the finder scope. But I do love towel rads for the fact that you can see the rest of the sky as you're aligning it. So you can sort of work out if you're off. And that's a great question, Tim. Yep.
Great, thanks for that.
If there's no other questions just for the moment, I just wanted to share a resource with you that I use with my students. And this is a really good resource for when you're teaching astronomy, whether it's with a high school or primary school, or if you're planning an observing night. So hopefully you've found this website before. Just give me a thumbs up if you have, and I've shared my screen. So yeah, just give me a thumbs up if you've seen it. Yep, I can see Tim's seen it. Awesome. And so this website's called Stellarium. It's like Planetarium, but for stars. So Stellarium -web.org. If you type Stellarium online into Google, it's the first hit. And then what you'll notice here is this is the default view of Stellarium. So you can see that I can see the night sky, but it's really not telling me anything. So if I want to explore the night sky to see what we can look at tonight, the first thing I wanted to do is come down here and turn on the azimuth grid. And what you can see is on the left-hand side of my screen, and if I zoom in, you can see these lines. And the first line is at 10 degrees horizontal, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees, all the way up to directly above us. If you wanted to go a little bit more complex, you could switch to the equatorial grid, which will actually show us the south celestial pole, which is where all the stars rotate around. But the point that I was going to show for the moment is if I turn off the equatorial grid, there's actually a really neat feature. You'll notice that it's detected my location, which is near Tamworth. By default, the starting time goes to what time you could observe at your own location. So this is pretty cool. It's showing me that at 6:41 tonight, that's the prime observing time. And then finally, on the far left-hand side, we can actually see what the planets are doing. So if you check this box on the left-hand side of the screen, this is really cool because you go, all right, we can plan what we want to look at tonight. And so if I was to observe tonight, I'd look down here and I want to look for a yellow bar that exists in the black area. So Mars is just about to set. Saturn is rising just before 6. So when it gets dark, Saturn's going to be climbing in the sky. And eventually Saturn's going to set a couple of hours, maybe 1 hour before 6 a.m. So tonight's a really good night for Saturn. It's also a good night for Jupiter. However, it's going to be quite late. It'll be like midnight when Saturn gets a little bit higher. And so this can actually help you plan your observing, which is quite nice. In addition to that, you can change the date to any day in the future. So if you want to go, okay, I'm planning an observing night at my school, the things you might want to consider is whether or not it's a new moon or not. So we don't want a full moon if you want to see some nice nebulas and nice globular clusters. So we can change the month, as you can see there. I can change the time. And we're now in November. And if I click at the planets, we can see that November is actually a better month of the year to observe both Jupiter and Saturn at the same time. Saturn's already high in the sky when the sun sets, and Jupiter's starting to rise. So if we were to observe it around 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., that's a really good time. I don't want to take up too much more of your time today. I hope you've enjoyed today's session, but I'd love to throw to you if you have any more questions about observing with your telescope. Yep. Have you got a question there, Sam? Sorry. No, you good? Shane, did you have a question? Are you good? Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to check transport wise, if I want to transport it from school to home to try it out and sort of get used to how everything works. What are the keys for transporting safely?
Yep, that's a great question. I face that from time to time. So if I'm going long distance, and you can actually see that actually you can't see right now, but in the background, just where I am, is the telescope box. So I never throw out the box. If I'm transporting it long distance, and by that I mean I'm driving for a couple of hours, I definitely want to put it in the box with the styrofoam, pack it away nice and neatly. If I'm just driving for less than an hour and I know the roads and it's not too bumpy, I would potentially put the telescope, if you could, lay it down all the way in the back seat if you've got a wide enough car, and put the base in the back. That's okay. For example, if I was driving from here to a friend's house in Tamworth, I might not put it back in the box. And if I'm in the same suburb, when I do an excursion with my students to Coonabarabran, it definitely goes in the box and gets fully packed away. The annoying thing about fully packing it away is you've got to take the finder scope off, which is actually quite easy, but it's the side things that actually take the time. Once you put it together with those side attachment points where it pivots, that's the thing that takes time. But yeah, that's really important to pack it away neatly. Another thing that I'll mention, because this adds to Shane's question, is when you're not observing, to actually put the cap on the telescope. And if you see dew forming on your telescope, so if you're at a place where it's really dewy, in the sense that as the night's going on, you can see condensation forming on the telescope, that's a really good time to stop. You can purchase dew heaters for telescopes, which are quite good. And if you're in a cold climate, it might be a good investment. What the dew heater does is actually keeps the telescope above the dew point and prevents dew forming on the telescope. But yeah, ideally, you're not observing if it's too dewy or misty. Another thing that I tell students, especially if you're observing and it's a little bit, you're walking on a dirt path, like in the sense that you're not on gravel or on a road, is just to keep foot traffic to a minimum, in the sense that you don't want them running around a heap, stirring up the dust. If you want to, you could purchase a square of AstroTurf, just to have a nice base for the telescope to sit on. Most of the time I like to do, put the telescope on just some grass if I'm, in a field somewhere with the students. The school playing field works quite well for observing. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Matt, thank you for all of that. That's been very excellent. I just want to ask about the electronics down below. Looks like there's a fan down there.
Yes, so that's a really good point. Thank you, Paula. So at the bottom of the telescope, you may have noticed there's a fan with a battery pack that you can plug into it. And what that does is it's going to cool the telescope. You want your telescope to come acclimatized to the outside conditions. If it's in a really, really hot room initially in your school, and then you move it straight outside to the night sky and it's quite cold, that's a big temperature difference. And you sort of always want your telescope to come to ambient temperature. And so I said, if you're not observing, to put the cap on. That's if you're not observing and you're finishing your session. But at the start of the night, you actually want the cap off, because you want all the air in the column of the telescope to actually cool down. You want that to equalize. You can speed that process up as well by trying to cool the mirror using that fan. And that fan just moves air, which is good. Great question, Paula. Awesome. If you do have any more questions, as I said, get in touch with Lara and she can shoot them onto me and I can answer them. Also, if you have questions about eyepieces and you wanted to purchase a different eyepiece that'd be really good for looking for planets, that really big 2-inch eyepiece is really good for, as I said, the moon and globular clusters. But if you wanted to look at a really tight cluster, is really good for open clusters. But if you wanted to look at a tight cluster, which is a globular cluster, you actually want a high magnification eyepiece. Yeah. Awesome. Yep. Sorry, there is a really good thing that Lara just mentioned in the chat there. I'm just going to mention this. If you go to the link that's in the chat, there's some resources that Astro 3D have put together for using telescopes with schools as part of the STARS program. So you can click on that link and check out those resources. The last thing I'll add is well done to all of you for joining for this afternoon, for learning more about telescopes. I hope you found this useful. Please let Lara and the team know how you go with your telescope. And if you take any photos of your kids observing the night sky, I'm sure they'd love to see that as well, which is really, really cool. So well done.
So on that note, we've finished 5 minutes before 5, which is perfect. And we'll hopefully see a lot of you in a fortnight, the next one. If there's if there's anything in particular that you don't feel that we've covered, then we may be able to cover some of those bits and pieces in the upcoming workshops.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lara. And just to add on that, I'll make myself a note. I'll actually attach a Telrad live with you. So I'll peel off my tape and stick the base on. Then I'll show you how to attach it, because you can get a little bit nervous when you're sticking it on. You're like, am I doing this right? So I'll grab a Telrad to show you.
Thank you.
Awesome. My pleasure.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
My pleasure. See you.